All right, a long run, we're going to bring the Cold War to an end today. And that's going to start off with talking about Mikhail Gorbachev, who becomes the leader of the Soviet Union in March of 1985. Now, as he comes into the Soviet Union, he's at the height of the Second Cold War. Remember this rise in tensions following the Soviet invasion of Afghanistan and the American election of Ronald Reagan. That Soviet-Afghan war has been dragging on for 6 years. The Soviet economy was stagnating. Early in his term, Gorbachev's got to deal with the Chernobyl nuclear power plant disaster that creates environmental and political crisis for his state. And he's going to recognize that the Soviet government just cannot maintain the spending on the military that they've been spending in recent decades. That's just not sustainable compared to what the United States can produce. So Gorbachev is going to issue a number of reforms for the Soviet Union to try to right the ship. Two categories of reforms. First, perestroika, which is a political and economic restructuring of the Soviet state, calling for a relaxation of centralized control of the command economy of the Soviet Union, an allowance for private enterprise and privately owned businesses in the Soviet Union, encouragement of Western investments and trade with the Soviet Union. And then the second category of reforms falls under the word glasnost, this openness and transparency for the Russian government. This calls for an open discussion of political and social issues, especially in light of the Chernobyl disaster and how closed the Russian society or the Soviet society was following that. This is going to allow for criticism of the Soviet government and the beginnings of what becomes essentially a free press in the Soviet Union. Gorbachev will also recognize that the Soviet Union simply could not keep pace with American military spending or technology when it came to the nuclear arms race. The Strategic Defense Initiative, that Star Wars missile defense system that the United States was funding to put anti-weapons technology in space, this could not be matched by the Soviet Union. And the threat of nuclear war from Mikhail Gorbachev was made more clear with the effects of the Chernobyl disaster. Gorbachev saw negotiations with the United States as his only course of action, and both Ronald Reagan and Gorbachev were willing to meet with each other, which is a big step for both. These two leaders would meet 4 times from 1985 into 1988 in what were known as summits, nuclear arms reduction talks summits. First in Geneva in November of 1985, the beginnings of talks to limit the threat of nuclear war. We call this the START talks, Strategic Arms Reductions talks. In Reykjavik, Iceland, in the next year, continued arms control talks between the two. In Washington, D.C. in December of 1987, an agreement to eliminate shorter range nuclear weapons. And finally, in Moscow in May of 1988, talks are continuing, agreements are made, and Ronald Reagan will publicly say that the United States is no longer the evil empire, which he had called them in the beginning of his term of office. Also in 1988, the Soviet Union withdraws from Afghanistan. Now, Ronald Reagan does need some credit in this discussion as well. Some historians point to Ronald Reagan's hardline stance against the Soviet Union in the early 1980s as ultimately giving Gorbachev no choice but to negotiate. And Reagan, for his part, was willing to negotiate and work with Gorbachev following his earlier, more fiery rhetoric. Reagan supporters argue that that détente period of the 1970s was a failure, and that pressure that Reagan had put on Gorbachev or on the Soviet Union in the 1980s, that could have been done back in the 70s and possibly brought the Cold War to a faster end. Now, beyond these leaders, there are some long-term factors contributing to the fall of the Soviet Union and the end of the Cold War. Soviet military spending was a huge part of their domestic economy, and they were still not reaching military parity with the United States. Lacking spending on consumer goods, as so much of the Soviet resources were being put towards the military, will create shortages for the Soviet people at home. Industrial output will decline in the 1980s in the Soviet Union, and worker morale was low. High absenteeism, high alcoholism rates, that Gorbachev attempted to solve the problem of by trying to limit alcohol sales and creating new dry laws in the Soviet Union. But this would actually create anger amongst the people and cut an important source of government revenue, as alcohol sales were heavily taxed. Some would argue that that détente period in the 1970s was actually a success and allowed the economic weaknesses of the Soviet Union to grow while conflict between the two states was avoided. Now, we also have to look to the Eastern European satellite states that as a cause for the end of the Cold War. In Poland in 1988, that solidarity movement begun by Lech Walesa that had imprisoned Lech Walesa for his protests in the early 1980s was legalized and political reforms were introduced. In 1989, in the first democratic elections in Poland, communists were defeated and the Solidarity leader Lech Walesa was elected president of Poland. In East Germany, with living standards far below that of West Germany, East Germans will continue to try to escape to the West. Now, of course, you can't make it through Berlin anymore, but they would try to get through Hungary and make their way on to Austria from there. Gorbachev made it clear, though, with protests growing in East Germany, that he would not intervene, just as he had not intervened in Poland. The days of Brezhnev in Czechoslovakia or Khrushchev in Hungary, those are over. So protests in East Germany grow. The government will begin to ease travel restrictions, which opens up new connections with the West. And in November of 1989, the Berlin Wall was stormed and ultimately torn down. So people from East Berlin and West Berlin could now freely come together for the first time in almost 30 years. Free elections in East Germany would follow, and the call for unifying with West Germany came in October of 1990. In Hungary, the Hungarian Communist Party offered liberal reforms and free elections in 1990 that resulted in the end of their one-party communist rule. In Czechoslovakia, the downfall of the communists came with what was known as the Velvet Revolution, a soft and largely non-violent revolution. And dissident leader Václav Havel will be elected the new president. Again, democratic elections happening in East Europe. In all of these instances, the Soviet Union does not intervene as they had in 1956 and 1958. The fall of the Soviet Union will ultimately come in 1991. The Soviet economy was still not improving, was still stagnant, and that is growing Gorbachev's unpopularity. Eastern European events are going to spark nationalist movements within the Soviet Union. And that starts with the Baltic states, Latvia, Lithuania, and Estonia, who push for independence from the Soviet Union. In August of 1991, an attempt at a coup to overthrow Gorbachev by some hardliners within the Soviet Union failed. And by December 25th, 1991, Mikhail Gorbachev will resign and the Soviet Union will officially be dissolved. This leads to a crisis in communism throughout the communist world, with Cuba, North Korea, China, and Vietnam being the only remaining communist states in the world. China and Vietnam will each begin their own liberal economic reforms, though their governments will continue to hold strong one-party communist dictatorial rules. The Cuban economy following the fall of the Soviet Union will crumble, resulting in their special period of austerity programs as heavy government cutbacks on consumer products and consumer supports were made. African states that had relied on the Soviet Union for aid were also in crisis, and they will see increased political conflicts and civil wars grow throughout the 1990s. That is it. That is our discussion of the Cold War. You guys should be ready to go for papers 2 and 3. We'll talk to you soon.